This podcast contains sensitive topics and discussions. Listener discretion is advised.
Tennessee's youngest woman on death row was sentenced at just 18 years old. But were there mitigating factors that were ignored? This is the Christa Pike story. Hi, Meghan.
Hi, Amy.
I am loving our new listener suggestion button on our webpage.
I know, I am too. It's great because now we can just see them automatically. Also, without having to, go through the emails. Even though I like emails, it's nicer to see them just kind of auto-populate. It's wonderful.
So this week, I took my case right from that beautiful Excel sheet that lists out the case suggestions. And I noticed this one was on there a few times. So I took a look and I knew that this was the one for me to cover.
I haven't seen this one and I haven't heard of this one.
I hadn't either, and I'm always surprised, no matter how long we do this for, that there's still cases that are shocking that somehow we don't know. There's no shortage of cases.
No shortage whatsoever.
All right, Meghan, let me introduce you to today's story. Let's meet Christa Pike. Christa Gale Pike was born in West Virginia on March 10th, 1967. She was born premature and with organic brain damage and a malformation of the brain. Unfortunately, her mother had used alcohol and possibly drugs during pregnancy, and baby Christa had spent her first few days of life in neonatal care. Luckily, she did start recovering, and while she did develop and grow fairly normally, she experienced childhood seizures as a result of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And not only did Christa struggle with her physical health, her mother couldn't take care of her, and her father did not want custody of his daughter. So Christa spent the majority of her childhood being passed between family members. She spent some time with her maternal grandmother, then some time with her aunt, then some time with her paternal grandmother, and then later on she would travel back and forth between North Carolina, where her mother ended up, and West Virginia, where her father still lived. Now, I'm not sure if the family wasn't equipped to care for her or if she made it difficult for people to care for her, but it's clear that there was not a lot of stability in Christa's early life.
Yeah.
Some reports say that by high school, Christa had changed school 12 times. So we see a total lack of stability and no way to make real friends or connections, or even those important student-teacher relationships that may have led to some help for Christa. And reports say she was also the victim of abuse at the hands of several adults in her life. Her father, who, as I mentioned, was estranged from her mother, her maternal grandmother, and several of her mother's boyfriends and husbands. Christa's mother was married at least 4 times, and reportedly none of the men were a positive influence in Christa's life. And in fact, Meghan, most of them abused her. And one boyfriend was actually charged with assault after punching Christa in the face.
Oy.
Christa was also allegedly raped by her grandma's boyfriend when she was very young, and also by a neighbor when she was just 9 years old.
I mean, this is just, unfortunately, the perfect storm. What a terrible childhood.
Yep. Other than being the victim of sexual assault several times throughout her young adulthood, to make matters worse, when she was 12 years old, her paternal grandmother, who ended up being the only positive and constant relationship in her life, passed away. And after her death, the now tween Christa was severely depressed, and she attempted suicide on several occasions by taking large doses of varying medication.
Amy, did anyone ever seek any type of help for Christa? Any social services, any mental health treatment?
This is where things aren't clear because some reports say that she did see a therapist or psychologist at one time and even was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. However, other sources say that's not so. Regardless, she was not treated. I don't know if she was diagnosed, but we do know that she wasn't taking any medication if she were in fact diagnosed. And she was likely self-medicating through drug and alcohol use, though.
Okay.
Now, after her grandmother's death, Christa was sent to live with her mother. And although her mom had a steady job at this point, she was a nurse, it still was not a healthy home for Christa. There were no rules, and on many occasions, Christa and her mother would sit around smoking pot together. Now, this relationship was more like friends than a mother-daughter relationship. There seemed to be a lack of stability and structure, and I think at this point, Christa needed a parental figure, not a friend. And as I mentioned, Christa's mom had a string of boyfriends, and she was married 4 times throughout Christa's childhood. So there were always men around the house, and they were either hostile towards Christa or outright abusive. And Christa would tell her mom about the varying sexual and physical abuse that she was suffering at the hands of her boyfriends, but unfortunately, her mother never believed her and never helped her.
Or she just didn't care.
I don't know. I mean, but it was bad enough that Child Services actually removed Christa from her mother's home after one of the sexual abuse cases was made known. But unfortunately, Christa was returned to her mother's home a few years later, although it was clearly still an unsafe environment.
How old was she when she was returned to her mother? She'd been gone for a couple of years, I assume, in foster care.
Mm-hmm.
Is she going back as like a 16-year-old?
She was early, like tween, 12, 13. It was after her grandmother had passed away at 12, so sometime after that.
Yeah, but you said she was removed from the home, I'm saying, for a couple of years and then placed back with her mom. So I assume when she's placed back
early
with her-
teen. Yeah. She was with her mom in her tween years, then she was removed, then she was back with her mom in her teenage years. But when life got unbearable with her mother, Christa would escape to her father's house in West Virginia. But unfortunately, their relationship was also strained, and she had been kicked out of his home on several occasions. Now, I'm not sure if it was due to rebellious behavior, but either way, I think if she was rebelling, it was likely a cry for help at this point. But unfortunately, her cries would go unanswered. And I don't think I need to tell you or our listeners, but, Christa struggled in school. At one point, she would stop going altogether, although she did earn her GED, which I think we can applaud given all that she was dealing with.
Oh, for sure.
She was without parental supervision. She was hanging out with a pretty tough crowd. She didn't have a steady job, and she was feeling lost and hopeless. Soon she would start shoplifting, but she was caught and arrested, and she spent a short time at a juvenile detention center for her crime. Now, as much as we could say, these juvenile detention centers don't always do well, sometimes they're the start of a long criminal career for young people. For Christa, it actually was the first time in her life that she had counselors who were helping her, and she felt like she maybe had a chance for the first time to succeed in her life. And through this counseling, Christa enrolled in a Job Corps training program in Knoxville. Now, Job Corps is the largest national residential career training program, and this was actually created under President Johnson during the War on Poverty. It was established by the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. And it's actually extremely successful. Do you ever teach about this program in your policy class?
I don't know, but I'm starting to think I should. Okay, let me hear more.
It was developed to help eligible young people between the ages of 16 to 24 complete their high school education, train them for meaningful careers, and assist them with obtaining employment. But it also provides transitional support services, which is helpful because not all programs do that. Now, currently, it operates under the Workforce Investment Act of 1998, but it's still very much alive and well. In fact, a recent study did a 20-year follow-up of individuals who went through these Job Corps programs and found that 80% of all of the graduates were placed in jobs, higher education, or the military. And there were several positive long-term gains.
That's wonderful. Is Job Corps a 1 or 2 year program? That's what I always understood it to be. Is that about right?
That's a great question. It usually ranges from like 8 months to 2 years. But I think the average time is between like that 1 and 2. And the purpose is like a transition for people to get on their feet, young adults to get on their feet. And Christa really, she decided she wanted to be a nurse just like her mom. And it seemed like this program would help her reach that goal. But unfortunately, Meghan, this program ended up being a destructive environment for Christa because shortly after arriving, she met 17-year-old Daryl Shipp. Now, he was there studying culinary arts. These two quickly began a relationship because they understood each other. Daryl also had a very tough upbringing. He came from an abusive home and had gang affiliations, but he, like Christa, was ready to get on the right track. He was really enamored with Christa, and she felt taken care of, and clearly someone with her background, that, she needed that, and she really took to him. Unfortunately, he did have violent tendencies, and he was into Satanism. But Christa followed along with what he did because she felt protected and loved by him. Christa would also meet a girl named Shadola Peterson. Now, Shadola shared many of the same traumas as Christa, and the pair quickly hit it off and became fast friends. She would also get into Satanism with Christa and Daryl, and the three of them would hang out often together. Also in the program was another young woman by the name of Colleen Slemmer. Now, Colleen was from Jacksonville, Florida. She was studying computer technology, and she kind of had her own crew. Just like any other setting with young adults and teenagers, there were a lot of cliques going on. So Colleen didn't hang out with Christa and possibly didn't even know her until a rumor began circulating. Now, this sounds like normal teenager stuff, right? So there's a rumor circulating that Colleen liked Christa's boyfriend. And some even said that the two of them had hooked up. And in fact, later on, Tadaro would say that he did in fact hook up with Colleen when Christa went home for Thanksgiving break. He obviously denied it at the time to her, but Christa was angry. She was very jealous and possessive of Tadaro, and she was certainly not going to let anyone break up their relationship. Again, this was the first time in her life that she felt truly loved and protected. Christa was so mad, in fact, that she apparently mentioned to one of her classmates that she was going to kill Colleen because she just felt mean that day. Now, the classmate didn't really take her seriously because who would?
Right.
And this seems so far-fetched, right? The classmate knew about these rumors, so she just figured Christa was upset about the potential hookup and that she was just kind of kidding around. But we would come to find out that Colleen had also told her mom that she was very scared of Christa and that she felt threatened by her.
Did other people feel threatened by Christa? You haven't mentioned, do we know, did she have violent tendencies or anything like that? Nothing that we know of?
She had her group of friends. She was a little bit tough. She put on a tough persona. Given her background, I'm not surprised. But no, at this point, it seems that she's adapting socially.
Okay.
On the evening of January 12th, 1995, Christa, Tadaro, and Shadola Peterson had plans to hang out as they normally did. But on this occasion, Christa invited Colleen along, and Colleen accepted the invite.
I'm surprised. Why would she accept the invite? This seems strange given the relationship between the two.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm thinking there could be two possibilities. Maybe Colleen saw this as an olive branch of sorts, and maybe she just wanted Christa to stop bothering her and come around to her. Maybe she wanted to desperately be part of their friend group, or maybe she really liked Tadaro and she wanted to spend more time with him.
All right. Yeah, fair enough. All those are possibilities.
So the plan that evening was to head to a nearby Blockbuster to rent some movies. I know we have some young listeners, but I'm assuming everyone knows about Blockbuster, right?
Oh, I thought you were talking to me. I was like, I spent every Friday night at Blockbuster for a period of my life. For people who don't know Blockbuster, which I hope most people do, it was like the largest video rental chain across the U.S. for quite some time. So, that's where I got my movies before there were streamers.
Yep, movies before DVDs. And then I'm assuming they switched over to DVDs before they just went out of business completely. Although I am pretty sure there's still one remaining Blockbuster. There was like a documentary on this. Have you seen that?
No, but now I'm going to look for it. Okay.
Anyway, so they were going to get some movies. Around 8 p.m. that evening, the four were spotted walking away together from the dormitory. And the four of them had also signed out. So we have eyewitnesses. We also have a log that tells us that they all left around 8 p.m.
Okay.
On the walk, Christa told the group that she had hidden some pot in a nearby park, a park called Tyson Park. Now, this was a remote spot on the University of Tennessee's agriculture campus. Now, I'm talking huge, hundreds of acres of open land. Christa told them that she hid some pot earlier in the day and they should go back and smoke. So the group agreed, and Christa led them through the woods to a clearing. At this point, she started a verbal altercation with Colleen. And this verbal altercation quickly turned violent when Christa punched Colleen. Now, Colleen fought back immediately, but Tadaro held Colleen down.
Ugh.
Now, I don't want to glorify the violence of what's coming next in any way, so let's just say that Colleen endured horrific torture at the hands of Christa and Tadaro while Shadola kept watch. This assault lasted over 30 minutes, and they taunted and beat Colleen, as well as carved a pentagram into her chest.
Oh, God.
Now, pentagrams are misunderstood. I didn't know this until I started doing some research for this episode, but a pentagram is a 5-point star, and it has a circle around it. And it's often misused as a satanic symbol, but it actually symbolizes unity and essence of life, which I did not know.
Why does it come to be associated with Satanism? I always assumed it was as well.
That's a good question, one that I was very curious about, but I had read an interesting analogy that the pentagram is no more the symbol of Satanism as the cross is the symbol of the Ku Klux Klan. So sometimes groups use symbols for their own meanings, but in the mainstream, it's really just a religious symbol that means positive things, not negative.
That's so interesting.
Unfortunately, tragically, Colleen ultimately died at the hands of her attacker, and this was after being hit in the head with a piece of asphalt. As we will later find out, Colleen begged for her life, and she tried to get away in several different parts of this attack. After the heinous murder, the three teenagers returned to the dorm. And while Tadaro and Shadola went to their rooms to clean up and go to bed, Christa couldn't sleep. She was too excited, so she knocked on a friend's door at 11 p.m. that evening. When her friend opened the door, Christa announced in an upbeat voice that she had killed Colleen, and she even showed a bone fragment to her friend. Her friend thought that Christa was just holding a piece of rock and kidding about what she had said she had done. So the two parted ways. Christa continued to tell people about what she had done. Again, her fellow students didn't believe her. Just a few hours after the murder the next day, Christa was curious about what was going on, so she returned to the scene to kind of check things out. Of course, the police were investigating because Colleen's body was discovered the next morning by an employee of the University of Tennessee. So Colleen went to the site and she was asking the investigators what was going on, if they had any suspects. She was very curious about how things were unfolding. I don't think you'd be surprised to find out, Meghan, that the police got a tip very early on that led right to the trio. And Christa was questioned first. Now, Christa was the only adult in the group at the age of 18. The other two were just 17, so they would need their parents present to be interrogated. When interviewed, Christa confessed fully to what she had done, but she would not give up the name of her friends. She was mostly trying to protect Daryl. I'm not sure if Christa really thought that they weren't going to find out or she just didn't want to be the one to say his name, but they clearly knew who this trio was. And this was happening quick. This was within just 36 hours of the murder that these three were taken into custody. So besides Christa's admission of guilt, you also have many eyewitnesses who saw the four leaving together, only 3 of them returning. This was somewhat of an open and closed case here. Investigators say that Christa spoke very matter-of-factly and showed no emotion or remorse. And you can hear this because her whole confession was taped and would later be played at trial. So you can actually take a listen to this as well.
She confessed right away?
She absolutely did.
Okay.
She told detectives that her plan was to scare Colleen, but that things got a bit out of hand. However, one of her statements in the interview was, quote, "I don't want to say I intended to kill her, but I would say that I didn't care if she died. I wouldn't lose any sleep over it if she did." So she was very flippant about this, and then the police searched her items. They found a piece of Colleen's skull in Christa's jacket pocket.
Oh, that's awful.
They also found jeans that were blood-soaked with Colleen's blood in Christa's dorm room. And there was a mountain of evidence to move forward with murder charges. All of their stories were pretty similar. Shadola was the lookout, and the other two were the ones that inflicted the injuries that would lead to Colleen's death. Now, Christa Pike's murder trial began on March 12th, 1996. Daryl would be tried separately, and we'll talk about what happened to Shadola in just a moment. Now, this trial was short because the evidence was pretty damning. Christa showed little to no remorse for the part that she played in Colleen's death. And although she did cry during certain moments in her trial, many believed it was all an act or that she was in fact just crying for herself and her situation. The jury found her guilty of capital murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Notice I said capital murder. Now that would mean that this would be a bifurcated trial whereby there would be a guilt phase and a penalty phase. In the guilt phase, they found her guilty. The penalty phase would be whether or not Christa Pike would be sentenced to death or to life in prison. The jury had spent less than 3 hours on the guilt phase and only about 2 hours on the penalty phase. Do you want to guess what happened?
Okay, I'm not surprised that they spent such a short time on the guilt phase. It seemed like the evidence was very clear, overwhelming. You have confessions, so that doesn't really surprise me. I'm a little bit more surprised that they spent such a short period of time in the punishment phase because I'm sure, I would imagine her defense presented all of those mitigating factors, her history of abuse born with medical defects. I mean, there's a lot of mitigating factors. Then again, the prosecution would go in with all the aggravating factors, and we didn't discuss all of it, but the torture, the prolonged torture and premeditation of this crime. But since, I already know the way this works out, I understand that they opted to put her to death.
Yep, that's correct. Christa received a death sentence for her role in the killing, and she was sentenced to die. And Meghan, this was a big deal because in Tennessee at this time, a woman had not been executed by the state since 1837. Of course, she was 18. If you look at pictures, she looks so young.
I'm sorry, what year was this again, Amy?
1996.
1996. Okay.
As you mentioned at the sentencing, you'll often have victim impact statements, and then you'll also have people on the side of the defense trying to argue. And Christa's mom was very much a supporter of Christa, and she admitted to being a horrible mother, and she talked about Christa's difficult upbringing. Since this crime was so brutal, I think everyone just wanted to see justice for Colleen.
Of course.
Now, there was insufficient evidence to prove that Shadola participated in the actual murder, so she was really just an accessory, and she cooperated with investigators and walked away with probation. Now, she would serve only 460 days in jail and was given only 6 years of probation. So we will definitely discuss that sentence, so hold off on your comments.
All right.
And now Tadaro, he was too young to be put to death because he was only 17 at the time. He was sentenced to life with an eligibility for parole in 2028. And there's a huge discrepancy here. A filing signed by her defense attorney, Stephen Farrell and Kelly Gleason, lay out the discrepancies between Tadaro's sentence and Christa's. They say, quote, Mr. Shipp was 17 years old at the time of Miss Slemmer's death. Christa Pike was 18. That is the difference between a death sentence and a parole eligibility in 2028. That difference cannot be equated with increased maturity or brain development. Christa was not more mature or more responsible than Mr. Shipp. Regardless, Christa was sent to Tennessee's death row, and Tadaro was serving a life sentence with parole eligibility. Now, was there any hope for Christa? 9 years after Christa's sentence, the U.S. Supreme Court abolished the juvenile death penalty in the landmark case Roper v. Simmons. The court held that executing people who committed murder before they turned 18 violated the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment because they, quote, cannot with reliability be classified among the worst offenders. Now, I'll tell you how this is relevant here in just a moment.
Okay, Okay.
I know. The court cited 3 main differences between juveniles and adults. Number 1, juveniles lacked the maturity and responsibility. Number 2, they were more vulnerable to negative influences. And number 3, their character was not fully formed. So regardless, Christa was 18. She wasn't 17. So even if this was retroactive, this rule would not help her. However, I think this shows the Supreme Court's recognition about these issues with sentencing anyone under 18 to death. And Christa was just 18. So I think it's still relevant because what is the difference between an individual who is 17 and a half or just turned 18? Is there really that big of a difference between their character formation and their maturity and responsibility?
Well, we can talk about that, but what I want to know is this doesn't have any legal bearing, though, on her case, because Roper was only applicable to under 18-year-olds, and she was 18.
You're right. This has no bearing on Christa's case, but the reason I bring it up is because the Supreme Court acknowledged that there is a big difference, and what I'm saying is 17 versus 18. So Tadaro Shipp was given these considerations based on his age, but just a couple of months older was Christa. So as I said, that ruling does not help Christa, but I think it brings some important issues into the forefront about Christa's maturity, responsibility. However, Meghan, it does not help that Christa has had some additional legal troubles while in prison. In 2001, she was convicted of attempted murder for nearly strangling a fellow inmate with a shoestring. Christa received 25 years added to her death sentence for the attempted murder.
Jeez, okay.
Not done. In 2012, Christa tried to escape by bribing a corrections officer and conspiring with another inmate. Luckily, the plan failed as there was an investigation that was launched before the follow-through, and the corrections officer in this case was fired for his part in the conspiracy. Now, I'm not sure if Christa incurred any additional charges or anything added to her sentence, but the purpose being that she's not a model inmate, so I don't think that's going to help her cause.
It sounds like she's also a career criminal, career offender, inside and out. I mean, that's what I'm hearing right now. She tried to strangle someone. I mean, I don't know the circumstances, but okay.
So to date, as of this recording, May 2023, Christa has not yet been executed, but when her date is set, Christa will be the first woman Tennessee has executed in over 200 years, and also the first person put to death in the modern era. Now, what that means is post-Furman. Now, Furman versus Georgia in 1972 was a huge landmark Supreme Court case that was basically a de facto moratorium on the death penalty. This Supreme Court case effectively put a halt to the death penalty in all the states in the United States by saying that the death penalty violated the Eighth Amendment. It wasn't until 1976 when, go ahead.
Well, I will say two things. In 1976, Greg v. Georgia, 4 years later, lifted the moratorium. But I also want to add that in the 1972 decision, some people will hear you say that, the Supreme Court said the death penalty was unconstitutional because it was cruel and unusual. But what people don't know is they weren't saying that the death penalty in itself was cruel and unusual. What they were saying was the application of the death penalty was so random that it was like being struck by lightning, where, one person might get it, the next wouldn't. They said that was the cruel and unusual part.
Yes.
So there was no systematic way to determine who was getting it, and that's what made it cruel.
Yes, and then we see after Greg versus Georgia, a lot of states changed their criteria for the death penalty. They changed their jury instructions, trying to make the death penalty administration more fair. On August 27th, 2020, the state of Tennessee petitioned the court to finally set a date of execution because this has been going on for quite some time.
Yeah.
However, as a response to that petition, in 2021, Christa's attorneys asked the Tennessee Supreme Court to recommend that Governor Bill Lee commute their client's sentence to life imprisonment, citing her age at the time of the crime, her, quote, severe mental illness, and, quote, horrific childhood. Her lawyers argue that Tadaro Shipp was the ringleader in the crime, and not only was he ineligible for the death penalty because he was just 17, but he will also be granted parole in a few short years. But Colleen's mother feels a little bit different about this, and she wants Christa to be executed, saying, quote, honestly, my heart breaks every single day because I keep reliving it and reliving it. I just want this to happen before I die. Otherwise, nobody will see justice. And then you have Christa's mother, who's also been quite vocal, talking about how she wants her daughter's life to be spared, and talks about how Christa has nieces and nephews. Now, both Tadaro and Christa have done interviews from prison. Christa, it's up to you to decide whether you believe she shows remorse. She talks about being sorry, but she also does not take full responsibility and continues to talk about the role the other individuals played in the murder of Colleen. There's no word really on what's happened to Shadola, but I would imagine since she stayed out of the news, I would like to think she got on the right track and she's living a law-abiding life. So the discussion, this is the big part of today's episode. Did the system get it right? Let's start with the easy one, Shadola.
No, absolutely not.
That was easy.
Sorry. I don't care that she didn't participate in the crime. She did participate in the crime by being there, by being a lookout. She was a facilitator. So no, probation is totally not appropriate. I would have wanted to see a much lengthier prison sentence for her.
Both of us work with individuals in prison who are serving life sentences for having less involvement as Shadola had. Shadola had an active role in the murder of Colleen. Now, this went on for over 30 minutes in which Shadola could have made the right decision. She said she was scared. She could have ran for help. Maybe she didn't want to break it up herself, but she could have left there, called for help, and she did not. So I do believe that she got off too easy.
Yep.
I do think that she is more culpable. I hope that she led a law-abiding life, and I hope she somehow made peace with the role that she played. Now, what about Tadaro? I mean, should he have gotten the death penalty? Did he get off easy because of his age? And most importantly, Meghan, should 1 year matter or just a couple of months matter? It's the difference between a life sentence and a death sentence.
It's so hard. We draw arbitrary lines. The Supreme Court is trying to be more informed, and they're looking to, the medical field and science to see the developmental delays in juveniles and their brains. But the fact of the matter is that if we're drawing a line, you should probably draw it where the medical field draws it, which is pretty much at 25. That's when the brain is fully formed. And, so I'm not saying, by the way, that that's where it should be, but I'm saying at least that would make a little bit more sense with, lining up with what we know scientifically. 17 and 18 is very arbitrary. I think 17 and 18-year-olds probably still both make very bad decisions. While I absolutely hate the crime, and I can tell you this, if these offenders were both older, in their 20s, let's say, in their mid-20s, I would not have a problem with the death penalty being applied, I don't think. However, due to their youthful ages, I don't think it's an appropriate sentence, nor would it be for either one of them. I do believe lengthy prison sentences with the possibility of parole at a much, much later age is likely, even though I don't love it, it's more appropriate.
Yeah, Meghan, as you pointed out, there is scientific research. It is known that the brain is not fully developed until after the age of 20. So at the very least, I think we can agree it's hard to differentiate between a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old. The disparity in sentencing is very problematic in this case. Since her incarceration, Christa has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and PTSD. And it was confirmed that she was born with brain damage and was severely physically, emotionally, and sexually abused. So regardless of if you believe her sentence is the correct one, I think we can all agree that the system failed her at a young age because she was never given the help that she so desperately needed.
Yes, I think the system failed her. And I think if anyone, she's the person who has very strong mitigating factors here. Unfortunately, based on what you've told me, it sounds like she hasn't maintained a good, behavioral record. It also sounds like she hasn't accepted responsibility completely for her crime. So, I wouldn't be in favor of her going up for parole at this point. Let's put it that way. I still think she's going to have to serve much more time before she would be considered if she ever is to make it off of death row.
Yeah, as you pointed out, it does not help that she has shown violence in prison. But who knows? I don't know if she's getting the help she needs. I have no idea if she's medicated or not, but I can tell you that she spends most of her time in Supermax, which is basically solitary confinement. She's in her cell 23 hours a day. And I'm sure this is a result of the heinousness of her crime, along with the fact that she still continues to be a threat to those in the prison environment.
Right.
Now, a little word about whether or not she's remorseful. I just want to read a quote from a website that supports Christa and the commutation of her sentence.
Okay.
Now, this is from Christa, quote, "I had more than my fair share of trauma growing up, and I realized that so many others have also, and they didn't commit violent crimes. I don't use that or anything else as an excuse for what I did. There is no excuse for what I did. I take full responsibility for my actions and regret everything that happened that night. If I could take it all back, I would. And not only to get myself out of prison. I know that's what a lot of people assume. I've already spent a lifetime in here, and I have no expectations of ever leaving these fences. That's not what this is about. I only want my situation to be looked at now through the eyes of logic instead of anger, and answered the question of if I deserve to die for a crime committed by 3 people. I'm not even close to being the same person I was over 25 years ago."
And that I believe. She's probably not the same person she was 25 years ago. And that statement in itself shows some level of maturity.
Yes. But again, the comparison to the other people, I understand what she's saying.
No.
It's very disparate, but I don't think she needs to bring them in. And I think she should just focus on the harm that she's caused to Colleen's loved ones. And I'd like to see a little more of that.
Yes, I agree with that going forward. Absolutely, for sure.
Now, Meghan, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. You and our listeners know that I'm personally against the death penalty, but I respect those who feel otherwise. But when you look at the death penalty, it doesn't really meet the goals of punishment if you really look at the data.
Well, it depends on which goal you're looking at. It does meet incapacitation because it's the most effective and fullest form of incapacitation, but it certainly doesn't meet deterrence, which I think you're going to discuss.
Yeah, so you're right, Meghan. Thank you for bringing up. It does meet incapacitation, and I would say it also meets retribution for most people.
Yes.
Right? Does it meet restitution, restoration? It depends on the victim because that's all about what the victim wants. And retribution is just the idea of an eye for an eye.
Yeah, it's proportionate punishment. It's because it's just.
Exactly. Now, the definition of deterrence is the punishment certain, swift, and severe? A punishment that does not fit those criteria will not deter future criminal behavior. So is the death penalty swift? Well, obviously in Christa's case, it is not. But I found a really interesting statistic. I always believed that the average time on death row before execution was a little more than a decade. And in 2000, it was 11 years.
Okay.
However, Meghan, in 2020, that number has gone up to almost 19 years.
Yeah, I thought it was north of 15 years now. I also think that's because we've been evolving and fighting the death penalty more and more states are getting rid of it. Others are trying to cite that. Scientific evidence that's come to light. So I see why it's slower.
Yeah, the primary reason is because of the lengthy appeal process. And most people would agree with that because we certainly don't want to execute the wrong person as we have done in the past in our country. And some states have had difficulty obtaining the drugs necessary for lethal injection. But Either way, my point being that it is not swift at all. Now, is it certain? In other words, when we talk about deterrence, certainty means You do A, you get B. I would not say the death penalty is certain because we see it in this case, right? Daryl and Christa did essentially the same thing, and one sentenced to death and one is not.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree.
And severity, of course, is subjective because to some people, the death penalty is too severe, and to other people, lethal injection is simply not severe enough.
Yeah, that's subjective. For me, I'm going to argue that it's severe, but I also know that when you look at the studies on deterrence and you measure what's the most effective part of deterrence, severity always comes up as the least effective. People don't typically tend to fear the severity of the consequence. They fear more getting caught.
And a lot of time, these are crimes of passion in which people aren't sitting there making rational decisions. And
Right.
what I mean by that is they're not necessarily, oh, I want to kill this person, but I might get the death penalty. It's not like that's going on normally in somebody's
Right.
mind. Obviously, if it's premeditated, it certainly could be. But either way, the death penalty is happening less frequently and there's less public support for the death penalty, mostly due to really the fact that innocent people have been exonerated from death row and also because the death penalty is disproportionately distributed to people of color.
Yeah, I think the fallibility issue has really brought it to a lot of people's attention. You know, the fact that we do get it wrong. We execute innocent people. And I think that's resonating with a lot of people in our society today.
And for me, that's reason enough to abolish it, right?
You know, that's where I stand too. When people ask me my stance on the death penalty, it's very complicated. But because of the fallibility issue, I'm generally against using it when I know we get it wrong.
Mm-hmm. The last thing I want to very briefly discuss, because we kind of went through it quickly. Remember, we talked about Satanism and that there was the pentagram, which they believed was a symbol of Satanism. This was in the 90s. And in the 90s, there was satanic panic. And I think that's relevant here because there was this societal fear of the occult. And there was fearful media depictions of, quote, godless teenagers who listened to deviant music. And in turn, this led to a high number of high-profile criminal cases that were heavily influenced by all of the social hysteria around this, quote, satanic panic. Now, I don't know how much that influenced the jury, but I couldn't help but think of the West Memphis 3.
Of course.
That was in the 90s, right? 3 teenagers who were wrongfully convicted on homicide charges, really based on little more than the suspicion over their goth lifestyle.
Yeah, it also made me think of the McMartin trials and some of the preschool scandals that were supposed to be, related to satanic worship. So yeah, there was quite a panic at the time.
Before we head out today, for those of you who feel that if you believe that Christa should not be executed, then you can go to mercyforchrista.org. So clemency is just the recognition that the ultimate punishment is not appropriate for someone who committed a crime at 18 years old. And so clemency would essentially be petitioning the governor to conduct a full review of the case and commute the sentence from death to life without parole. So I found this case very fascinating because it brought up a lot of issues that are relevant, Christa's mental health, her age, culpability, disparity in sentencing.
Mm-hmm.
So I love when our listeners suggest these cases that really provide a platform for us to talk about these bigger issues.
I do as well. And hey, if you do believe strongly that Christa's sentence is unjust, then there's an action item you can take as well if you want to get involved. I also did not know anything about this case, so I just appreciate learning about Christa's case and all of the issues involved.
Meghan, though, before we head out today, let's just take a minute to answer a question from one of our supporters.
Okay.
And I think we received a similar question in the past, but the question is, are there certain types of crimes that are attributed to the female gender?
Yes. There are certain crimes that are shared by males and females, certainly, but we do look probably towards more violent crimes committed by males usually because of socialization and whole other lot of reasons. But for females, we typically look at females committing crimes of what we call survival. These are crimes that they commit usually because they've been victimized in some way and they need to survive financially, provide for their children. Oftentimes, females are more disproportionately involved in sex work, also in theft. And so economic crimes, but lower level economic crimes and drug crimes. And the drug crimes are oftentimes because they are trying to either cope with the fact that they've been victimized in so many ways, or because it is a way to numb the fact that they're involved in sex work. So it's a very sad cyclical story. And it's very sad that we punish these women who are mostly victims.
I think that's relevant to today's case as well.
I do as well. A little bit different. Hers wasn't a crime of survival, but she certainly was a victim as well. There's no doubt about that. And as we say in Women in Crime, we look at victims, we look at offenders, and oftentimes the two are one and the same.
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. And Meghan, thank you for taking the answer on that one. And to all of our listeners, thank you again for listening today, and we will catch you next time on Women in Crime.
Women in Crime is hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer and editor is James Varga. Music composition is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as virtual happy hours and an extra full-length episode each month. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenincrime.
Sources for today's episode include Knoxville News Sentinel, WKRN, Vox.com, Newsweek, mercyforchrista.org, Case Law, tncourts.gov, Wall Street Journal, and NPR.